You have probably heard someone say they were saved by the bell. Maybe a school bell rang right before a teacher could ask a question. Maybe a meeting ended at the perfect time. Or maybe someone escaped an awkward moment because something interrupted it. Today, the phrase usually means a lucky escape. Something was about to go badly. Then, just in time, a sound, a signal, or an interruption saved the day. But the phrase has one of the most famous origin stories in everyday language. People often say it comes from a time when coffins were fitted with bells, so a person who had been buried alive could ring for help. It is a creepy story. A person wakes up underground, they realize what has happened. They reach for a string, a bell rings above the grave, and they are saved. But is that really where "saved by the bell" came from? Or is this one of those stories that sounds so good, people repeat it even when the evidence points somewhere else? I'm Earl, the creator of Everyday Sayings and Origins. To keep each episode consistent, I use my digital likeness. Now back to the story. Today, saved by the bell means someone was rescued at the last possible moment. The danger might be serious, but usually it is not. A student might be saved by the bell when class ends before they have to answer. A speaker might be saved by the bell when time runs out. A person in an uncomfortable conversation might be saved when their phone rings. The phrase is about timing. Bad moment coming. Sudden interruption. Problem avoided. That is why it is so useful. It turns a lucky escape into a simple image. A bell rings and the pressure ends. That alone gives the phrase a strong shape. But the coffin story gives it something else. It gives it fear. The fear of being buried alive is old and powerful. Before modern medicine, people sometimes worried that a person could be mistaken for dead. That fear was not completely random. In earlier centuries, medical knowledge was more limited. Signs of death were not always understood the way they are now. And stories about premature burial spread through newspapers, books, rumors, and local legends. Because of that fear, people really did invent safety coffins. Some designs had tubes for air. Some had windows. Some had flags. Some had ropes or cords that could connect the body inside the coffin to a bell above ground. The idea was simple. If the person inside woke up, they could signal for help. That part is real. Safety coffins did exist. People did worry about being buried alive, and bells were sometimes part of those designs. So at first, the coffin explanation seems believable. There really were bells connected to graves. There really was fear of premature burial. And the phrase "saved by the bell" sounds like it could fit that image perfectly. But that does not prove the phrase came from that practice. This is where the story starts to separate into two parts. One part is true history. Safety coffins and burial fears were real. The other part is the origin claim. The claim says the phrase "saved by the bell" came from those coffin bells. That part is much harder to prove. And when phrase researchers look at older uses of the expression, the coffin story does not seem to be the strongest explanation. A much more likely source comes from boxing. In boxing, a round ends when the bell rings. If a fighter is in trouble near the end of a round, the bell can stop the action before the fighter takes more damage. The fighter gets a short break. They return to their corner. They get a moment to recover. In that sense, the fighter has been saved by the bell. That explanation is not as creepy as the coffin story, but it fits the modern meaning very well. The danger is immediate. The timing matters. The bell interrupts the trouble, and the person gets a temporary escape. That is exactly how we use the phrase today. Someone is under pressure. Then the bell, or some kind of interruption, stops the moment. The boxing explanation also fits the phrase as a figure of speech. Sports phrases often move into everyday language. People say someone is on the ropes. They say someone throws in the towel. They say someone rolls with the punches. They say something was a knockout. Those phrases all started in or around fighting and became common ways to describe life. So "saved by the bell" fits that pattern. A boxing phrase becomes a school phrase, then a work phrase, then a phrase for any lucky escape. That kind of language shift happens all the time. A phrase begins in one world, then people hear it enough that they start using it somewhere else. Eventually, the original setting fades, and the phrase belongs to everybody. That seems to be what happened here. The bell in the phrase probably does not come from a grave. It probably comes from a ring, a boxing ring. The coffin story is memorable because it feels like a horror movie. The boxing story is stronger because it matches how the phrase behaves. The bell ends the danger. The person survives the moment. The escape happens at the last possible second. Still, it is easy to understand why the coffin story spread. It has everything a good legend needs: fear, rescue, a strange invention, a buried person. A bell ringing in the dark. It gives the phrase a dramatic backstory that people remember immediately, and once a story like that attaches to a phrase, it is hard to remove. People like origins that feel like secrets. They like the idea that a casual phrase hides something shocking. That is why the coffin explanation keeps coming back. It makes people say, wait, is that really true? But a good origin story has to do more than sound interesting. It has to match the evidence. And with Saved by the Bell, the evidence points more toward boxing than burial. That does not make the coffin story useless. It still tells us something important. It tells us what kinds of stories people want to believe about language. We want phrases to have vivid beginnings. We want the words to connect to a scene we can picture. And if the scene is dark or strange, even better. But language does not always begin in the most dramatic place. Sometimes it begins in a more ordinary setting. A sports rule, a work habit, a tool, a custom, a sound everyone recognized. Then, over time, people attach a better story to it. That better story may be more entertaining but less accurate. This is one of the reasons origin stories can be tricky. The most memorable explanation is not always the most likely one. And the boring answer is not always boring once you look at why it survived. With Saved by the Bell, the boxing origin still has plenty of power. Picture a fighter near the end of a round. They are tired, they are cornered, they are taking hits. A few more seconds might change everything. Then the bell rings. The round ends. The attack stops. The fighter gets a breath. That is not boring. That is the phrase in action. A sudden sound changes the moment. A person is not saved forever. They are saved for now. That detail matters. In boxing, the bell does not win the fight for you. It only gives you a pause. You still have to continue later. That is often how we use the phrase in everyday life. The bell does not solve every problem. It just saves you from that moment. The class ends. The phone rings. The meeting runs out of time. The subject changes. The pressure breaks, only for a moment maybe. But sometimes a moment is enough. That is probably why the phrase works so well outside of boxing. Everyone understands the relief of being interrupted at exactly the right time. You are about to be put on the spot. Then something happens. You get a way out. It feels like luck stepped in. And the phrase gives that relief a sound. A bell. Not just any sound. A clear signal that something is over. Bells have been used for that purpose in many parts of life. School bells end class. Church bells mark time. Doorbells announce visitors. Alarm bells warn of trouble. Boxing bells start and end rounds. A bell is a public sound. It tells everyone the moment has changed. That is another reason the phrase feels natural. When the bell rings, the rules change. You stop working. You start moving. You answer the door. You leave the room. You return to your corner. The bell creates a boundary. Before the bell, pressure. After the bell, release. That is the feeling inside Saved by the Bell, and it explains why the phrase can work even when there is no actual bell. A phone call can save you by the bell. A timer can save you by the bell. A sudden interruption can save you by the bell. The sound itself can change, but the idea stays the same. Something arrives just in time. The trouble stops. The person escapes. So where does that leave the coffin story? It belongs in the story of burial fears and strange inventions. It belongs in the history of safety coffins. It belongs in the world of creepy facts people like to share. But it is probably not the best explanation for the phrase itself. That is the difference between a real historical practice and a true word origin. A practice can be real and still not be the source of the phrase. Safety coffins were real. Coffin bells were real in some designs. But Saved by the Bell most likely became popular through boxing, where the bell could literally stop a bad moment. That is the cleaner answer. Not the creepiest answer, but probably the better one, and it shows why this phrase is such a good example of how language gets misunderstood. People hear the phrase, they find a dramatic story that seems to match. Then, the dramatic story becomes the explanation, but the phrase may have traveled a much more direct path, from boxing ring, to everyday speech, to classrooms, offices, phone calls, and awkward conversations. So why do we say, saved by the bell? Because in boxing, the bell could end a round just in time to spare a fighter who was in trouble. That image moved into everyday life. Now it means being rescued from pressure, embarrassment, danger, or discomfort by a perfectly timed interruption. The coffin story is memorable, but the boxing story fits better, and that is often how origins work. The legend gets remembered because it is dramatic. The truth survives because it makes sense. If you enjoyed discovering the story behind this everyday saying, subscribe to Everyday Sayings and Origins. Each episode uncovers the hidden history behind the words, phrases, rhymes, and traditions we use without thinking. I'm Earl. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next origin. Peace.